Welcome everybody, my name's Paul McGinn. I'm the director of the UWA Public Policy Institute. And first of all, I just want to acknowledge that we're meeting on Wajugnanger land. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This is the second panel we're having as part of the Love, Longing and Lust theme, working with our colleagues from ECU. And the title of this panel is Let's Talk About ... Pornology, Pornucation and Pornocracy. And as Zara and a few others who know me, I love a good portmanteau and I love parentheses. And I do that in order to kind of highlight that things are contested, in at least in an academic context and obviously in the real world. So we've got four amazing speakers this evening. So I'm just going to do a bit of a quick overview. I'm going to work from immediately to my right and across. So it's an absolute pleasure for me to welcome Dr. David Lay from New Mexico here to Perth. And David and I have been chatting with one another on Twitter. I don't call it X, I call it Twitter, for about the last 4 or 5 years. And I've been trying to get David, I held a panel at AVN in Las Vegas about 4 or 5 years ago, and I tried to get David on. It just didn't work out. And it took me to get him all the way to Perth for this to happen, so unbelievable. And so welcome, David. Welcome to Perth and WA. So David's an internationally recognized clinical psychologist and author. You might have seen or read 1 or 2 of his books, Insatiable Wives, which is about cuckolding. So if there's any cucks in the room, David's the person to speak to later on. And then also Ethical Porn for Dicks, where he takes a kind of critical stance and kind of looking at pornography. Next we have Giselle Woodley, and I only met Giselle earlier in the year, but I've been kind of following her work, and she looks at consent, young people and pornography in particular, and I suppose given in the current climate that we're in with social media bans and age verification, and big questions around how do young people encounter pornography and understand pornography. Giselle's in the midst of her PhD, submitting soonish. That was the supervisor, by the way. Yes. So how many weeks? A few weeks away. So a good Christmas present to yourself. So welcome, Giselle, and Giselle's local as well from Perth. Next, a round of applause, yes. Next we have the host from the previous session, Alan McKay. So we're part of the Celtic Fringe. I'm from Belfast, Alan's from not Glasgow, Falkirk. So great football team. And Alan and I have known one another for quite a while, and actually had Alan along with Zara here in Perth in 2019, where we ran a kind of similar panel where the three of us delivered a kind of a 3-headed lecture, and then we had a workshop the next day as well. So welcome back to Perth, Alan. Thank you very much. Give it up for Alan. And then finally, Dr. Zara Stardust, all the way from Queensland, but came via Sydney to get here to Perth. So it's great. I met Zara, I think, back in 2017, was it? 2016? In the US at a special series of sessions that we were having as part of the Association of American Geographers Conference. And Zara was one of the presenters in that. And we had that year, we had about 25 papers in that special session around a whole series of different issues. So it's great to see you back in Perth as well, Zara. So welcome. So we're going to do things a little bit differently from the last panel. So what I've asked each of the panelists is to give a kind of short 3 to 5 minute kind of overview on a key topic that relates to their work and their research as it centers around pornography. So, and the order is going to be basically actually the way that they're sitting here in the chairs, which makes my life really easy. So, Dr. David Lay, the floor is yours. You've got no more than 5 minutes, and I will stop you.
5 minutes is a long time. I mean, the average sexual encounter is only about 90 seconds. So we've got time for a good 3 or 4 encounters here, right? Last name Lay, I didn't have a lot of options. Being a sex doctor was really my only choice. I chose to call this little section porn addiction or shame affliction. Because over my career, and I'm a clinical psychologist and a sex therapist, I kind of launched into this work a few years ago for reasons we'll probably talk about later. But I have seen many hundreds of individuals who identify themselves as being addicted to pornography. As I work with them pretty consistently, at some point they will say, "Doc, I can't stop masturbating." But here's the funny thing. None of them are doing that while they say this. None of them are masturbating while they tell me they can't stop. Which raises a question, what's really going on here? I'll ask you, what is the average number of times an individual who identifies as a porn addict watches pornography? Anybody have an idea? Throw out some numbers.
10.
10 a day?
Just 10?
10, just 10, just 10. Just 10. Every 10 minutes, people. All right, anybody else? He's way off. Anybody else? What's that?
What?
Once a day. Once a day. Less than once a month. The average porn addict watches pornography less than once a month. 10 times a year. So it's not about frequency. The number one predictor of identifying as a porn addict is feeling shame and guilt around masturbation, watching pornography, and the sexual desires you have. What's that about? It's easy to say it's about religion, but I think it's about much, much more than that. Because, for instance, we have a number of young men these days that are not particularly religious, but view it as less than masculine, view themselves as weak men if they masturbate. What is pornography? Pornography is nothing more and nothing less than a material created to enhance sexual arousal. They did these fascinating studies at a sperm donor clinic, and they found that watching pornography while masturbating to produce the sperm did not increase sperm count. But it did result in the men reporting a more powerful and a more satisfying orgasm. One man I worked with told me that he had realized pornography was, for him, the same thing a vibrator was for his wife. It was a tool to enhance sexual arousal, to increase orgasm, to make achieving orgasm easier. That, I think, is the scary thing, though. First, I will say, pornography is just like social media, and here we are in Australia, where just a couple of days ago, y'all did something interesting. Just saying. Now, I mean, you got to go a while to catch up with the states on crazy, stupid policy. But pornography, just like social media, is what I call a shiny object. Shiny object syndrome. Here is this problem. Let's blame it on this. And then let's do everything we can to ban that. without ever acknowledging the complexity around this issue. The thing that makes pornography scary is that, number one, as I said, it enhances sexual pleasure. Sex that feels good is scary and intimidating and threatening for some people who don't want you to enjoy sex too much. Particularly, they don't want you to enjoy sex that might be threatening or challenging to their values, not yours, theirs. So as I wrestle with the idea of pornography and pornography addiction, what I wrestle with is it is about teaching people to be afraid of their own sexuality. As a therapist, that's not in my bailiwick. As a therapist, I want to help people to embrace themselves and accept themselves. We'll talk more.
Thank you, David. Well, right on the 5-minute mark. So there's the benchmark, everybody, okay? So. Giselle.
So I also have an unfortunate name that, my name's Giselle, but my friends call me Giz. And then my last name is Woodley, so Wood and Woody. So I had no hope. But I'll talk a little bit about the research project that I've been attached to for the last 4 years that have consumed my life, apart from having a baby. And that's looking at teens' perceptions of online sexual content, which I was very fortunate to come on as a PhD student with my lovely chief investigators in the room, Professor Lelia Green and Dr. Deborah Dudek. And I came on as a sexologist, and I was really interested in how teens perceived both pornography, but also how pornography operated in relation to how they learn about sex. So we interviewed 30 teenagers, and 19 of those teenagers were kind enough to agree to come and speak to us a year later to see if their views had contrasted or changed or stayed the same. And then we conducted 4 focus groups with teens. And so we had an amazing diversity of teens. We had a number of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, some cold population, and also some gender diverse teens, particularly in our focus groups with pansexual teens, asexual teens, gay, queer, straight. So we had an amazing diversity, particularly in the focus groups. And I suppose what really became clear in terms of speaking to the teens is that they are keen and open to talk about sex, and they're living in a digital age where information is available at their fingertips, and they're curious about sex. And we also interviewed the parents in the first phase of data collection. So we interviewed the parents in a separate room at the same time as the teen, so that they couldn't really listen in as well, but also so that they could share the views and we could compare and contrast them. And it really appeared that there was this gap between the knowledge that's offered by parents, which teens only seem to be receptive to till the onset of puberty or when their sexual awareness was growing. Although incredibly important to maintain that the door is open to continue those conversations. And then there was also seemed to be an unspoken limit in what can be talked about in a school setting, which is an institutionalised setting. And the research shows that teachers too feel that awkwardness when talking about sexual topics in schools. And so teens also relate that sex in schools is not really talked about. It's talked around. It's talked, it's not specifically discussed. So, and everything's in the lens of fear. So it's STIs, pregnancy, contraception. And interestingly, because we obtained the data as consent was being rolled out and after it was being rolled out, interestingly, it appeared that consent was adding to that. So teens are perceiving consent as permission for sex. So we had male participants talk about needing permission slips and consent apps for sex and focusing on the not getting in trouble rather than ethical sexual experiences. And then on the other side, we're having young participants, gender diverse participants, female identifying participants, sharing that they're having these growing fears around sex because they're talking about sex within the context of unwanted sexual experiences, rape and sexual assault, growingly when discussing consent. So they're getting a very one-sided, distorted view of sex from a very fear-based negative lens. And they're curious about sex and they want to know about the specifics of sex, as well as pleasure. And so I would ask, where do you get that information from? And as one teen told me, I don't want to learn about going down on a woman from my mum, which I think is pretty fair. And so we would ask, and I pay my respect to these teens because they shared very intimate details about their sex lives and their porn habits, which is really difficult to do. And we, there's this depiction of porn as just this one branded wham bam thank you man aggressive pornography, and there's data missing there's a gap in the literature in terms of the types of porn that teens are watching. And teens shared with us that they're not always watching the hardcore wham bam thank you ma'am kind of porn. They're looking for depictions of mutual pleasure. They're looking for soft, ethical, feminist pornography. They're looking for queer bodies. And so I think, especially with the social media ban taking away another really important source of information identified by teens, that's definitely filling the gaps between parents and homes, is that before we go ahead with age verification bans, which I've got a lot of data onto and I'll speak about later, but we really need to fill that gap and look at ways that we can fill that gap. And teens toyed with the ideas of educational soft porn, and there's a lot of interesting findings in relation to that. But yeah, my question is, where do they learn about that? And for a lot of teens, that was porn. And so I've come out the other side seeing the nuance. Nothing is ever black and white, and nothing's ever good or bad. And in this instance, there are a lot of benefits that teens acknowledge, that, as well as negative impacts that they thought as well. And I think I'm at time.
Perfect timing again. Unbelievable. Alan and I were talking earlier about academics over-speaking, and Alan reminded me that no one ever complains when an academic is under time, So let's see if Alan can maintain the record of keeping on time or under time. So Alan, can you tell us just what's the little working title for your little 5 minutes?
Are we on?
We're on.
3, 2, 1. So, the title of my piece is Pornography Unrealistic? And the answer is, yes, of course it is, and that's not a problem. So this is based on some work I'm doing with Emma Phillips and Pavla Novakova. Our position can be summed up quite simply. We do not want pornography to be more realistic. We want pornography to be less patriarchal. And those are slightly different things. The question about whether pornography is realistic has come up a lot recently because there's an increasing focus on reaching young people with what's called porn literacy. And it's often taught in schools or in other ways, this idea that you inoculate young people against the negative effects of pornography by telling them it's not realistic, and encouraging them, well, mainly to abstain from it, but if you have to watch it, then be judgmental and critical about it. So we did some research, and we had a look at, we went through some of the porn literacy resources. These are some of the things that are unrealistic about pornography. These are quotes. The girls in porn seem willing to share themselves with a man. That's unrealistic. Real women aren't nearly as into sex. That's not realistic. Women in porn will dominate or act submissive. That's not realistic. They'll have anal sex, double penetration, multiple orgasms, or sex divorced from relationships. That's all unrealistic. So it may be that not every person has sex in that way, but we know some people do. It's not unrealistic for them to have sex like that. Now, there is something in sex that, in pornography, mainstream heterosexual pornography, that Emma and Pavla and I were concerned about. And that was, in mainstream commercial pornography, there is a tendency to show women having orgasms from penile intromission into a vagina. Most women outside of pornography do not reach orgasm this way. In one study we looked at, 21% of women said they'd experienced an orgasm through penetration with a penis alone. Now, we're not saying that, therefore, that is unrealistic and we should have more pornography that focuses on other forms of sex to give women orgasms because that is more realistic. We're saying we should have more pornography that focuses on ways that help more women to reach orgasm because it's patriarchal not to. There is a reason why there is such a thing as the orgasm gap. Sociologists have identified heterosexuals. 91% of heterosexual men in a survey said they experienced orgasm at their last sexual encounter. 39% of women did. Now, the problem is not women, because lesbians, 98% of them have a climax when they're having sex. It's heterosexuality, and it's this model. So we're not saying that pornography needs to be more realistic, but we are saying it would be nice to have less of a focus on the idea that not only do we define sex as a penis going into a vagina, but that this in itself will give every woman a screaming orgasm. Because a lot of the time, it won't. And as Giselle says, there's very little focus on school sex education, very little focus among parents in teaching kids how to have good sex. So who's going to do it? And if they're relying on pornography for that, or even for mainstream films and TV, once you've noticed it, you can't unsee it. In a movie, they'll have sex, it's over in 90 seconds. The man puts his penis into a vagina, and the woman comes immediately. So if that's what we're relying on for sex education, we need to do better. There you go, done.
Perfect. Wow. So
We got 90 seconds left.
45 seconds left, which means that Zara gets your 45 seconds. So Zara, over to you.
Thank you. Just to recognise as well that we are here on stolen and unceded Whadjuk country, and to recognise that there is so much more for us to do in the struggle for truth-telling and treaty and land back. I also want to recognise that we're here at a time when pornography is under attack by governments and platforms alike. We're also here at a time where there's a massive backlash against sexual health and rights and justice around the world, especially trans rights to healthcare and abortion care. And we're here at a time when we are living through multiple genocides, many of which are being live streamed to our devices. And so for many of us who are interested in porn and porn regulation, I think it's useful to think about how these things intersect. The war on pornography is linked to the war on trafficking. It intersects with the war on terror. It's also linked to colonial land grabs. And it wasn't that long ago that the Australian military was marched into Mutijulu in the Northern Territory under the guise of protecting people from their pornography use. And it became an offence in those communities to possess explicit material where it's not an offence anywhere else in Australia. And that was also happened and at the same time that they suspended the Racial Discrimination Act, they compulsorily acquired land, they began quarantining welfare benefits. So I think it's really important to think about these ties between pornography regulation and colonialism. So yeah, I guess in my research, I'm interested in how pornography as a kind of rhetorical tool gets used as a weapon, or it gets wielded in different ways to justify different things. Many of you might know a quote from US Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart when he said, "I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it." Super vague, very typical approach. And I always go back to this this quote by Walter Kendrick, who says, like, pornography is not a thing, it's a concept, and he always uses quotation marks around it because it's really a rhetorical tool that has been used to describe clothing, advertisements, so many different things. So during my PhD research, I was really interested in how governments think about porn and see porn, and on the one hand as something that is contagious and corruptive and super dangerous, and then on the other hand as something that is just totally valueless, and you know, it's something that has no value and it needs redeeming with like artistic or scientific or educational merit to make it okay. And I was really interested in watching how kind of obscenity law travelled around colonial jurisdictions with these ideas of kind of dirt and lewdness and obscenity and offensiveness. And then when I was doing my postdoc research, I started thinking a lot more about how those things then get baked into code. And we now have machine learning approaches where algorithms are trying to determine what is sex or what is pornographic Or what is nudity? And of course, this leads to all sorts of collateral damage in terms of picking up queer content, health promotion content, sex education content, harm reduction content, because it's really difficult to tell what is the difference between art and pornography or education and entertainment. And so when you look at, like, I guess, government agendas and kind of public porn policy, at the moment, they're really very much just focused on prohibition and surveillance. And so the approach is screening, detection, removal, or restricting access. It's never about, like, how do we build better, more equitable sexual cultures? But the research tells us, like, that young people want information about how to have pleasurable, consensual sex, how to practice kink safely. Parents are looking for vocabulary to talk about porn with their children. Porn performers are fighting for so many different things, from fair pay to being able to have a range of different safer sex options, to negotiate contracts in advance, to have more control over our images so they don't get leaked or monetized without consent, to have control over the marketing language so you don't make something and then it gets branded with a really homophobic or misogynist kind of title or racist title, to change the tagging systems that are used to describe our bodies, and also, like, access to justice and access to collective bargaining power in our workplaces. So when I interviewed people as part of my PhD, these were all of the kinds of things that came up, but they're never things that governments are interested in. Like, they're actively disinterested in these things. And then in further research where I've been talking to producers and queer, feminist, sex worker-led platforms who are trying to take different, more ethical approaches to content moderation and curation, their experiences were frequently about deplatforming and demonetization, so it was impossible to advertise, or it was about financial discrimination, so people had not been able to open bank accounts, or they'd had their funds frozen and stolen, or there was, like, onerous legal requirements that kind of breached their privacy. And so many of these projects just effectively shut down because it is so difficult to even survive in a kind of regulatory climate that is dominated by tube sites, many of them just built on piracy and monopolization. And so, yeah, my interest is really how governments kind of ignore all of this. And often people say, well, we just need better porn. But I think, like, that puts a lot of onus on industry, and it kind of just lets governments off the hook for all of the things that they could be doing. Because often better porn exists and amazing porn exists, and it has for centuries. But, you might not see Black-owned businesses or body-positive content because they may be suppressed by algorithms that are favouring and amplifying thin white bodies. Or you might not see feminist pornography because it's buried in the search engine results. Or you might not see queer sexual practices because they're illegal to depict or they're against the terms of service of the platform. So, yeah, I think, like, governments rarely have porn on their agenda, and I'm really interested in what we can do to build more equitable porn ecosystems. Often the approach is governments will say, porn is it's misogynist, it's racist, people shouldn't view it. But, of course some porn is racist. We live under white supremacy. Like, shouldn't we think about how we're going to dismantle that? Or how are we going to dismantle racial capitalism that values some bodies more than others? And that is not something that just happens in pornography or media. It's something that happens in health and immigration and incarceration. And of course some porn is misogynist because we live in a world where, 93 women were killed this year. We have so many Indigenous women and girls and boys who are murdered or missing, or as Amy Maguire calls it, have been disappeared, who receive very little media coverage. So, we need to, thank you, Paul, we need to address all of these issues, misogyny and racism and queerphobia and ableism, broad scale, offline and online, before we can expect our content to look different. And maybe if we do that, then we will have cultural media and film and pornography that looks different to what we see today. So yeah, my research is really about how we can think differently about porn, how we can build more equitable sexual cultures, and build a different relationship to sex and to work and to media.
Thanks, Zara. So I should have cracked my second joke when I started, saying if you came here to see porn, you're in the wrong place. But unlike our first panel, if you were here for love, you're in the right place. So we're really trying to, from our four panelists, what underpins all of their research really are questions of policy more than anything else, and that's that we're really interested in at the Public Policy Institute, and research as well. So. I want to take you all kind of back in time a little bit. So I've got a question for all of you, and if you can give me a quick response to this one. So I want to know why and how did you start researching pornography? So I'm happy for whoever wants to start first. Alan, you look pretty eager there. You're on the edge of your seat.
I didn't intend to, and to be honest, if I had known the vitriol, if I had known how many death threats I would get on a regular basis from challenging the narrative about pornography, I'll be honest, I don't know if I would have gone this direction. If I'd known just how terrified and hateful people are around this topic, I might have thought twice. I might not have, though, because I fell into it because I saw so many people that I was treating who were experiencing tremendous external and internal shame, self-loathing, self-hatred for their sexuality, which manifested in the pornography they watched. And as I worked with them, what I found was that what was happening was that we were focused on the pornography and not the person. As a therapist, I want to deal with a person. I want to deal with the person that's sitting in front of me. I got interested in talking about this because I saw, again, that shiny object taking away from dealing with people and the actual issues that they were struggling with that were manifested in the pornography. And I saw that focusing on the pornography, chasing this shiny object, didn't help the people, but instead hurt them. That became my passion to try to help those people.
Thanks, David. Giselle, you look like, do you want to step forward?
I will keep the thing going. I'll give the safe for work answer. I'm quite a spiritual person, and this is a difficult question to answer because I never thought I'd be in research, and I certainly never thought I'd be researching porn. But I don't know how to describe this, but call it a higher self or the universe. But I was given a quest, and I said yes to the quest, and I was told the next steps would lay out. And when I returned back to Perth, this PhD opportunity came up, and I wasn't really that interested in porn. In fact, I probably had some low-level traumas to do with porn. And I just knew this was the next step. And even though I didn't meet the traditional requirements for a PhD, I got in and here I am. And it's an interesting journey because I realised I wasn't being open to the teens' views about porn because I had my own ideas about pornography prior to starting and felt, sort of echoing the stories in the media, I suppose. And so I adopted processes of reflexivity to really look at my position in relation to my research and really see, to be more open to the teens' views because I realised I wasn't. And I sort of touched on it before, but I've really come out the other side recognising that nothing is black and white and that there definitely is nuance and there definitely is benefits and positives. And it's really only because I've taken these processes and really had a hard look at my shifting position. And I participate a lot in public discourse. I write for The Conversation quite regularly, and I also get death threats. So, and my bank account hacked and things like that after writing articles. So I too might not have chosen this. But I realised how treacherous it was going to be. But also I think it's really important work because I think it ties into the need to talk about sex and sex education so importantly.
Just on that, to kind of reflect a little bit, I suppose, where I come from in this space. So I'm a geographer, and pornography isn't normally associated as an area of study within geography. It's film studies, cultural studies, psychology. It's become a big thing there. But for me, as a geographer, I've landed in this space because a lot of my research in the past has been around what I call contentious issues. So I looked at kind of the significance of race and urban regeneration and community participation. I looked at sectarianism amongst 9 and 10-year-olds in Northern Ireland and how they perceived one another. I've done research on Irish travellers, Irish gypsies, and kind of marginalised groups. But underlying all of that, I think, is the faith that I was brought up in as well. It kind of conditioned me in the sense that sex was this taboo and you weren't allowed to talk about it. And for whatever reason, I'm always curious about contentious kind of issues. And I think that was a driving factor in a way for me. And so in my research, it's about destigmatization and trying to demystify things. I've been lucky so far that I haven't had any death threats, which I think is appalling in a kind of democratic kind of world that you can't talk about these topics and issues. And this is kind of why we have this kind of space in a way. And when I had Alan and Zara in 2019, that was part of our objectives then. So I think it's appalling, particularly when you have free speech warriors banging on about all of these things, but it's only on their terms of free speech, not all of our free speech, in those senses. So, Alan, I was a Catholic boy growing up in Belfast, and sex was a taboo. What about you in Scotland?
So I was a proddy boy growing up in Scotland. So I'm 53. I was a little queer boy in 1970s Scotland, and when I first saw a porn mag when I was 16 and went down to London, it was literally the first representation of a gay person I'd seen. Because in the 1970s in Scotland, there were no homosexuals representations of it. The soap operas didn't have it, the dramas didn't have it. It was literally, pornography was the only place in which people of my sexuality existed. And that was powerful, and that was important. And that's changed now. Nowadays, you can't watch a TV program that doesn't have queers in it. Like, literally, you try and find one. You can't find one. And I love it. Oh, my God. I think about the baby queers now growing up, watching Agatha all along and just seeing so many queers and so much beauty. And it's wonderful. But still, that interest in pornography maintains. And in terms of a career, because that's my career now, it's all I've done for 30 years is write about porn. And like Zara was saying, it's tied up with so many other things. It's not just itself. And so many academics are really boring. And you find that the people who are interested in porn and passionate about porn and understand why porn matters tend also to be passionate about race and decolonization and structures that need to be broken down, and about joy and about love and about pleasure. And so these are my people that I want to spend time with. So that's why I keep on doing it.
I hasten to add, we're not in that so many boring people of academics, right?
You're the good
We're well
ones.
outside that. Zara, why and how?
I mean, I started doing this research because I was making porn. I was a stripper for about 15 years before I kind of started working in porn, and I had written my master's thesis on striptease, so it made sense that then I write the PhD in porn. But I guess a few things happened to me when I was filming porn that kind of piqued my interest in classification and regulation. So I'd had like my labia had been airbrushed for like a popular kind of softcore magazine, and I had learned that, you know, it was in response to a classification requirement that genitals have to be discreet. And then I had worked on a film which was a film in 3D, and both my co-star and I had squirted in the film, and we'd squirted direct to the camera, and I was like, oh my God, I can't wait to see this in 3D. It's going to be amazing. And then when I got the DVD and they'd edited it out because they were concerned that it might be seen as urination, which is a prohibited fetish to depict in Australia. And so these things were just like of interest to me. And at the same time, I was also studying law, and I'd read a number of cases in my law and gender class about how judges thought about sex workers, describing sex workers as less likely to feel a sense of revulsion if they experienced sexual assault than a chaste woman. And I had got a job at a law firm where they had kind of said to us, don't wear low-cut blouses in court because you might distract the judge. And so it was just like I was seeing all of this kind of queerphobia and whorephobia within the legal system. And at the same time, these men around me in the law firm, I couldn't really take seriously because I'm like, you're like the same people I've literally seen down the road at Men's Gallery behaving appallingly. And so I kind of just, so I went and got a job at it was my local sex worker rights organisation. It's the National Peak Sex Worker Rights Organisation, Scarlet Alliance, as a policy officer. And we wrote a lot of submissions to government inquiries. And I noticed that there were just kind of so many inquiries about pornography that asked just the same thing over and over. And there's an inquiry at the moment in New South Wales that is framed almost identically to the one 5 years ago, which is like, how do we stop young people from experiencing the harms of online pornography or something like that? And I just became really interested in this kind of disconnect between what was actually happening in industry and how governments thought about pornography as, what pornography is and what pornography does, and this monolithic, static idea of it. Yeah, and I guess in the academy, when I was doing the PhD, I had all sorts of experiences of I got a teaching fellowship, and I had somebody's dad who was concerned that a porn star was teaching criminology at the time, and he'd found all of these personal screenshots from my Facebook page and emailed them to the dean of the law faculty, and I had to
You're jumping to my next question
sorry.
which is good. We're going to bleed into it, but that's fine. That's on that, it's interesting that this person was finding all this stuff on Facebook, obviously on you, so obviously doing a deep dive around the place, which says something about them really more than anything else. So, but on that issue, doing porn research or work on sex work, research on sex work, and I tend to call all of us, I use the word sexademics, that kind of as a catch-all term. It's it's seen as dirty research. So I'm just kind of curious, how do colleagues, somebody you meet at a party, or David, you've just flown in across the country, you're on the plane, the person next to you says, so, what do you do for work? And you turn around and you say,
I sell insurance. Are you covered? They put their headphones on and they leave me alone for the rest of the flight. I recommend it. I'm not an academic. I published a lot because of the very privileged place I hold in the field, which I don't feel like I deserve, but I will seize because of the effort I can make on behalf of other people. I end up publishing a lot of research with colleagues, but I'm primarily a clinician, and I was telling Claire on the way here, and I did want to just thank Claire and Paul for all of the effort that they made to get me here. It's incredibly touching. But I was telling Claire on the way here, most therapists get no training in sexuality. Most people don't realize this. Most couples therapists, most marital therapists get no training in sex, even though people who have more sex live longer, and couples that have more sex have healthier relationships. You would kind of think that we would want to study this shit, or at least try to help people have better sex. But again, it is viewed as dirty. It's viewed as not serious. It's viewed as taking away. Alan and I were talking a moment ago about you shared that academics in the 1800s were not allowed to be married because of the idea that if they were having sex, that it would take away from thinking about important thoughts. Kellogg's Corn Flakes was invented to prevent masturbation. Not because there was the idea that food that tasted too good would get you worked up and want you to have sex or jerk off, but because the idea was if you are too focused on pleasure, there's that word again, if you're too focused on physical pleasure, it takes you away from contemplating the higher spheres. And that we are better people by thinking more about God than by thinking about the physical world around us. That, I think, is the challenge, because I think that thinking about what healthy sex is with consent and honesty and safety and shared values is the way we treat each other and ourselves better. That's what I want to move towards, as opposed to this black and white idea that I think Zara and Giselle have both mentioned.
I hate cornflakes. Really hate them. So I don't know what that says about me, you know. Zara, let's come back to you, because you started to walk into that topic. I mean, you've told us that you were a stripper and you've done porn and you're a PhD and you're working in a law firm. So there's different domains with different types of people. What's the reaction when you say that you're a porn scholar?
People are often genuinely interested and want to have conversations about it. Often it's a bit voyeuristic. Sometimes it's a bit fetishistic. Sometimes people just don't know what to say. And also people don't really know how to behave around you. I mean, I've kind of been also, like, often in academia, I've had people in the hallways be like, oh, I've watched your porn or whatever, and I've not really thought maybe this is not the place to mention that, or... and I've had also people, write articles about me saying I should never have got a scholarship because it shouldn't have been publicly funded kind of research. But I think this is something that's very, I've been very lucky, being a cis, white, tertiary educated, middle class person working in academia, that I have that kind of, my decisions are treated as agentic, whereas many sex workers experience so many different things in academia, from, harassment from their supervisors and doxing and just classrooms that are not culturally safe, and many professions like nursing or law or psychology that have ethics admissions boards often have real gatekeeping practices about who they think ought to be admitted to those professions. So yeah, I think whorephobia is really rife kind of in the academy. It's a hard place to exist. But there's also, it's also, I think, one of the biggest risks is one of co-optation. They want sex workers in the academy. I think the academy wants sex workers, needs sex workers for their legitimacy, to prove that they're progressive. I don't think that sex workers necessarily need the academy, but there's often this, we just need a sex worker on the diversity committee, or we need a sex worker on, the advisory board, and there's that kind of risk that you get co-opted into this system. I think that sometimes that's even more of a risk than those other kinds of pejorative reactions.
Alan, what kind of reactions have you had?
It's really interesting what Zara's saying, because universities are profoundly middle-class institutions, repressed and repressive, and you're welcome to come and join if you're a woman or an Indigenous person or a queer, so long as you behave appropriately according to the rules. So a few weeks ago, I was on a panel at my university. I didn't organize it. When I turned up, I realized there was 6 men and 1 woman. And I thought that bore commenting upon. So I apologize for the fact that it was a sausage fest. 2 weeks later, I was called into my boss's office. There had been complaints made that I'd used the word sausage fest. HR was in the meeting, and I was warned that I had potentially breached the university's code of conduct, which requires us to behave with respect towards each other at all times. So it didn't matter that there was a panel with 6 men and 1 woman, but it did matter that I'd called it a sausage fest. So the fact that you can't even say that one word, I think, tells you a lot about how universities cope with people who are vulgar in their interests and vulgar in their presentation.
Thanks, Alan. I think I've been very fortunate in my university's given me a kind of bit of a social license to go into looking at the geographies of pornography, basically. And what I tend to look at is kind of, I've been very fortunate in getting data from one of the big online porn companies, basically. And they've given me aggregate data on Australia down to city level. And I found out about what devices, what kind of categories of porn and stuff that people are viewing and stuff like this. So at an institutional level, it's been pretty positive. But there have been certain individuals who have kind of, they look at you and they go, that's not serious scholarship, or really, And, when we look at it in the real world, in a policy and a political sense, and we're kind of circulating, this will bring us back to a question in a little bit. So in the US, porn in about 20 different states has been called a public health crisis. Yeah, we're going to come down to that in a second, Alan. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten. And it's driven by porn addiction, just to come back to kind of David's comments as well. So it is a real issue. There is merit in discussing, debating, researching, and looking at this stuff. So I kind of think that's there is this mixed world that Zara's kind of highlighted too as well. So Giselle, now that Alan scolded me, we're going to come back to you.
I don't really have much to say. A new question or the same question?
Yeah, just what type of reactions, just quickly.
Yeah, just quickly. I would say at dinner parties, I've realised when the what do you do for work question comes up, make sure other people answer first, because otherwise you end up dominating the conversation because everyone wants to know about it, and you somewhat turn into a confession booth. People want to tell you about some porn or sex experience that you didn't necessarily consent to. So that's all I'd say about that.
Okay, excellent. So those are the questions on the first P in the title, the pornology, the study of porn. So I want to kind of move into the kind of pornucation side of things a little bit. So there's my portmanteau there. So in thinking about policy and sex education and where does pornography fit in, where and how does pornography fit into sex education programs? So I'll come back to you, Giselle, because you've been doing this stuff particularly with young people. Can you give us some insights there in terms of through a kind of policy lens rather than what kids are saying? If you've looked at things, what are schools doing in this kind of space? In terms, as Alan said, there's been this focus on porn literacy, which we've spoken about before. That's becoming more of an issue. Our Watch, an intimate partner violence organisation, put out a report last week stating that teens are using pornography as a default sex educator, and that we need pornography literacy. I suppose my fear is if that occurs, that, like Alan said as well, is that we would just tell teens that porn is unrealistic, and with the teens we spoke to, they overwhelmingly already were saying all the harms that were being perpetuated in the media and saying, we know this isn't realistic. So my fear is that it'll be yet another fear-based, risk-aware addition to the curriculum, and it's not useful. But in terms of policy and existing literature, there is some interesting research in Europe that talks about bringing in sex workers into classrooms to educate. And I was actually at a conference with Scarlet Alliance recently at the Tackling Stigma conference, and we were talking about my findings in terms of teens advocating for perhaps soft educational porn. And they made the point that, we were talking about this research that talked about sex workers coming in, and they made the point that, well, sex workers are already teaching teens about sex because they're using porn as a source of information. So as controversial as that would be, it's not actually that far from the truth. And I thought that was a really interesting point. But I will say that that teens are looking for explicit, detailed representations of sex and bodies.
And I think we do need to look at something that fills the gap in terms of offering that in a way perhaps to older teens, or reducing the age, or having more access to healthy representations of sex and bodies, and whether that means porn or otherwise, something we need to examine.
Alan, you about 2 years ago, you published a little kind of pamphlet about porn education that was geared towards parents, which I shared on my Facebook page in my local neighbourhood.
Yeah.
You know, where I kind of said, you know, parents, if you've got questions about porn and your children, check this out. Yeah. So can you tell the audience here who maybe not know about it, what that pamphlet was about, and kind of where you're coming at kind of pornucation or porn in sex education?
Yeah, so we produced this leaflet for parents, Porn and Your Kids, and it was just a series of quite straightforward points. Like, number one was, you do not want pornography to be your kid's only source of information about sex, because that's not what it is primarily designed for. And so often when I'm talking about pornography with parents, it ends up becoming the conversation about sex education. And it always comes back to Western Australia, because that is the home of the booklet called Talk Soon, Talk Often, produced by Jenny Walsh, produced by the West Australian Health Department many years ago, and it's the basic guide to parents about how to talk to your kids about sex, and it's not rocket science. From the time when they start asking questions, which is usually about 2 years old, when they say, why is my body different from theirs? Where do babies come from? You answer the questions in age-appropriate language. You don't use it as a prompt to tell them everything about sex. You make it, the most important thing is you're not awkward, you're not embarrassed, you answer the question, and then that's it. And then they come back to you with their next question and the next question, and then when they're 8 or 9 years old and some bully at school shows them explicit material to try and upset them, which is always a problem, they'll come to you and talk about it. So it's about ensuring that pornography is part of a healthy, balanced diet of information about sex, because, as we were saying before, not every parent is comfortable telling their kids how to give head, and not every kid would be comfortable learning how to give head from their parents. But if they have parents who can talk about sex with them, then seeing that and being able to talk with their parents about that is not going to do them any harm. So it's about thinking about it as an ecosystem of information rather than just pornography and nothing else.
Thanks, Alan. I've related into my other question, which I'm going to kind of pose to David and Zara. How can we empower or educate parents to take those reins that Alan's kind of highlighted, to be more confident, to be more comfortable, you know, to be more, you know, casual, you know, in a positive sense of that word, with children and young people? Zara, David, Zara, you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, just building off what Giselle was saying earlier too about like sex workers and porn performers are already doing so much of this work. You know, in writing about consent, in writing about communication. Sex workers often speak at universities. Many sex workers are now doing training to become intimacy coordinators in mainstream film. I think sex workers have a really pivotal role to play. A friend of mine actually organised a porn literacy panel at her daughter's high school, where she invited porn performers to come and speak alongside like psychologists and nurses and sexologists. And the reports from the young people and the students was that it really it kind of increased their integrity of it. They were less skeptical. It was a really successful event, and they actually ended up running 2 of them. But I think it's also important to remember like sex education is not just for young people. Like often a lot of adults haven't had good sex education, and so adults need sex education. And we've done a lot of work with other porn performers where we have done live sex demonstrations as part of a sex education workshop among adults, which we did at the Berlin Porn Film Festival. And also, like, film festivals like that are also really important cultural moments where people can watch pornography together and then talk about it. And you talk about it in the queue for the bar or the queue for the bathrooms or on the panels in the Q&A, and you kind of deconstruct the textual media. And so I think there's all of these opportunities like that should play a greater role in sex education. There's also some amazing initiatives like Sex School in Berlin, which unfortunately has now closed down, but they were a group of porn performers who would make sexually explicit videos all about sex education, and they would literally walk you through consent and communication and different sexual health issues, and they're an amazing resource. But, you know, due to many of the issues that I discussed earlier, like it became unviable for them to continue, which is a really damning thing. I think, yeah, so just to remember, I think parents need porn literacy, governments need porn literacy, but like Alan said too, porn literacy is not just about, you know, often I think there's this, you know, it's just people will teach you that porn's not realistic or don't do that. But they're really saying is that, you know, only heteronormative or cisgendered or kind of coupled experiences of sex are healthy and are realistic. And often it's very transphobic in their approach. It's very sex work phobic in terms of what they think is a natural body and what they think is natural sex. Yeah, and it's super problematic. So I think porn literacy has to be not just about media literacy, like all of the issues I spoke about before in terms of actually understanding the media environment in which your products are made, the labour environment of who is working and how they are paid. That is essential porn literacy. People need to know, you know, if you're watching Pornhub, like, you know, their main business is kind of around data aggregation and data harvesting, and so thinking about like how, what kinds of porn is being recommended to you and how is that being assumed on the basis of your algorithmic sexual profile online. And so if you want to diversify your tastes, you need to kind of look more broadly, and like all of these things are essential porn literacy. And also, like, many of us make sexual media. If you've ever taken a nude, if you've ever sent it to a lover, like many of us are involved in kind of recreational and personal practices of creating and disseminating sexual media. So porn literacy is not just media literacy, but it's also about our digital sexual cultures.
Just on, you mentioned Pornhub there, so I wrote to them recently and they were very kind to give me some information which is coming up in their 2024 year in review. So guess what the #1 category of porn in Australia is? That's a question for the class. Have a guess. Lesbian, #1. #2? Begins with M, ends in F. MILF, then anal, then Asian, then mature, and then transgender. Is the top 6. That's the top 6 categories. And in terms of search terms, so this is where people are putting in their own preferences rather than going to the categories page, which is what the algorithm will throw back at you more than anything else. But so will the search terms. So what's #1? Another question for the class. Asian is #1, then MILF, then hentai, lesbian slips to #4, and then threesomes, massage, cream pie, anal, Indian, Latina, joy, public, stepmom, big tits, real amateur, femboy, big ass, POV, Japanese, anime, ebony, gangbang, Chinese, BBC, Australian gets in there. So, and the list goes on. And trans comes in at 27th in the list. So that's hot off the press, so to speak. So David, from your perspective as a clinical psychologist, you must get this in terms of parents maybe who come in or maybe got concerns about their teens and they don't know how to talk about it. What would, from a clinical perspective, what can we do to help parents?
Similar to what folks have been saying, I teach parents that when you punish your kid for coming to you with a question, you're guaranteeing that they're never going to come to you with a question again, and they're going to be struggling with that next issue and the issue after that all by themselves. What I focus on, and I love Zara's point there about the need for adult sex education as well. we don't pay enough attention to what porn is used for. First, I mentioned it's a tool to enhance masturbation. It's a tool for pleasure. It is an opportunity to experience a form of sexuality that you may not have in your life. So I guarantee you, the people that are searching for lesbian porn are neither lesbians nor having lesbian sex, but they really would like to watch two women have loving, hot, passionate sex together because that's not in their life. I've learned to watch. I was giving a talk in, I think, Nebraska, and the point at which I was talking about female interest in dominance and submission, 50 Shades of Grey, etc. There happened to be a knitting group in the room next door. And as I got to that point, they all came and stood outside the door of my talk and watched. There was this cute surfer guy walking by a minute ago with his shirt off, and as Zara was talking, he stopped and he looked. I was hoping he was going to come in. So porn is an opportunity to experience a form of sexuality or sexual expression, experience that is not present in your life. The third thing, though, that I think is super important, there have been 2 studies published just in the past 3 months that looked at huge samples. I mean, well over 100,000 participants, data sets of people that identified themselves as addicted to pornography. The top 4 predictors of identifying yourself as addicted to pornography were shame and guilt about your sexual desires and using sex to manage or regulate negative emotions, particularly stress and depression. Males in most Western societies are not encouraged to express or manage negative emotions. The only negative emotions we're allowed to have are anger. You're not allowed to cry. You're not allowed to be sad. So men find out that looking at porn on their phone or watching porn is a fucking amazingly effective way to turn off negative emotions in your brain. But it can't be the only one. That is the education that I do predominantly with men that I work with around these issues. I try to understand, what are you using porn for? I have men do a behavior chart. When are you watching porn over the week? How much are you watching it? We'll talk about this tomorrow. I'm doing a class about working with folks around these issues. And oftentimes men will come in and they're like, oh, well, I look at the chart and then, wow, you're watching a lot of porn on Tuesday night. Tell me about Tuesday night. Well, that's when we have dinner with my in-laws. Tell me how you feel about your in-laws, right? So, again, as a psychologist, I'm less concerned about the porn and more about the person. I want to know what you're using this thing for. And then I can maybe help you figure out other ways to achieve that outcome without being solely reliant on this one thing. It's fine if you use it sometimes, but it can't be the only thing, because if you get stressed out at your kid's parent-teacher meeting, looking at porn is maybe not the best thing to do right then. What else you got? So that's the education I do with lots of parents, again, is let's think about why your kids are watching porn, and rather than focusing on porn, let's try and deal with those issues.
Excellent. Now, I have another question on age verification, which is a signal that you're not allowed to ask a question about age verification, because I'm going to come to you for questions, but the only question you're not allowed to talk about is age verification, okay? So, who has a
ID before you get to ask the question?
So, who has a question, and ideally a kind of policy question around porn? So you had a question in the last session, Gil, so I'm going to defer to somebody else. So Did I see another hand up there at the back somewhere? No? Nobody has, there's a hand. I see a hand there in the back. Hello? Do you want to come up? We don't have a porn chair, unfortunately, like a love chair, but we do have a mic, so I think Zara's mic has got lots of cord. If you can tell us who you are, if you're happy to do that would be great, and then it gives you your question.
My name is Gabriela. I am a stripper, sex worker. I'm also a sexologist and advocacy for sex workers and sexual health in general. I think it's a comment, it's a question as well, because I am pursuing some sort of independent research at the moment on the reasons why clientele go to strip clubs. And I think it's the same questions that like David was just commenting. I think men come to these places of this to find a safe space to fix their this masculinity that is they don't have all their emotions. They come to experience their desires validated without shame, without guilt. They come as well with this desire to be vulnerable, to be broken, and come out feeling safer and feeling manly enough, which is fascinating. And in that regards, it's like the whole conversation just seems so inspiring in a way, because I think policy needs to look into porn is not the problem, sex workers are not the problem. The problem is the lack of education around sexuality, about gender, about masculinity, about identity. And yeah, just thought,
Okay, would anybody like to respond to that, Zara?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point because, I mean, a lot of Alan's research has been about the othering of porn consumers. And I think so often in the policy debates, I mean, like politicians, it's kind of their platform for being able to regulate porn is the fact that they don't watch porn and, you know, they will get fired or, you know, they'll have to be super ashamed or resign if they are found to be going to a strip club or watching porn. And so I think that's really important point. I remember reading books on pornography in the past where one of the authors went to a sex cinema and they described the audience as this congregation of the mad, the lost and the lonely, and they talked about like lecherous grandfathers and like the language that people use to describe consumers of sexual services is so pathologizing and demonizing. And also we know that people of many different genders watch pornography. We know that people of many different genders hire sex workers of many different kinds. You know, I'm just thinking of Hilary Caldwell's book, Slutdom, which is out at the moment too, where she, for her PhD research, interviewed like women who purchase sexual services and for all of these different reasons and different ways that they kind of improved their consent practices and their communication practices through that process. And so it is super healing for so many people. And yeah, and I'm also reminded of research by Clarissa Smith and Fiona Atwood and Martin Baker in the UK, where they did a big study of porn consumers, and just like you've described, like people watch pornography for so many reasons, like they're bored, or for humor, or for stress release, or for so many things, but everybody's just focused on porn's ability to have this kind of affective response, you know, because it can arouse you in your body, you feel something in your body, somehow that becomes dangerous, even though that may not be the primary reason, like you've described, that people are actually watching it.
Would anybody else like to respond to that question or comment? I will. I mean, I'm Lucy Neville, who you met recently when you were in the UK. So her book, Girls Who Like Boys, which is, you know, an investigation of women who watch gay male porn. You know, and it's mainly hetero women who are watching gay male porn, and they watch it because, primarily, not so much because of the sex, it's more the aesthetics of how it's shot. You know, the gaze, the longing, the loving gaze that's kind of portrayed more than anything else. So in her interviews with her respondents, it's not about the physicality per se. There's other dimensions of what's embedded in the narrative and in the scripting, in the portrayal of gay porn for those women.
I think it's a great point, and I can be guilty of overly focusing on male experiences here because that largely is who I work with. But many women that I work with that will admit to me and acknowledge that they watch porn, they share that they watch gay porn, just like Paul said. But interestingly, many of them tell me something different. They tell me that they can watch gay males have sex and not worry about a female in the video maybe being exploited or taken advantage of. And so now females watching porn are more subject to experiencing a disruption of sexual arousal. So if a fat, hairy person comes in and behaves inappropriately, they're going to get turned off. So they curate the material they watch so that they can enjoy their mojo and not lose that experience. Now, many women with a history of sexual abuse and sexual assault tell me they watch hentai, they watch animated porn, because again, they don't have to worry about anybody in the video being taken advantage of or being assaulted. It's not real. And it allows them to suspend that concern. Again, I get excited about this because I'm just fascinated with the way people learn about themselves from the material they watch. Early on, there was this amazing research that looked at men watching group sex porn, and they found that group sex porn, particularly gangbangs, multiple men and a single woman, was some of the most popular pornography online. But most pornography online is made for men. Most men fantasize about multiple women and a single man. So why? Well, they found that when men watch gangbang porn versus any other kind of porn, they ejaculate harder, their ejaculate contains more sperm, and the men get erect again sooner. And it's this combination of sperm competition and all this other stuff. But we didn't know that before porn. And so, again, there is this fascinating exploration and learning about sexuality, sexual response, sexual desires, what sex is and isn't for us, what sex does and doesn't do for us, what is and isn't in people's lives and sexuality, that we get to learn from porn when we focus on the person as opposed to the porn. Right? That's like my one line. I'm sorry.
Well, I can see the policy line in here in a way because there are questions at the moment in Australia about, we're entering a bit of a demographic crisis because fertility rates are declining and natural increase. So maybe...
Gangbang porn for everybody.
Yeah, and then we'll see a spike in the population increase, basically. So, look, I'm just conscious of time, and I just want to come back to my last question because just last week we had the social media ban, so we've seen policy in action. Some might say that it's policy on the run, which is policy underdone. So in terms of things like age verification and social media bans, how effective are they as kind of policy responses? And I'll come to you in particular, Zara, first on the age verification side, because I know you've done quite a bit of work on this, as your colleagues up at QUT. So can you just give us a nice insight to something about how good or bad age verification is?
Yeah, well, Alan and I actually did a whole paper on age verification that you can read in the Journal of Big Data and Society, and we worked with our colleagues at QUT who are data scientists, and it was really cool because we were kind of blending computer science approaches with more humanities and social sciences approaches. But some of you may know that the federal government has announced, in May they announced a $6.5 million trial of what they call age assurance technologies to restrict access to online pornography. They announced it as part of a package to address gender-based violence in Australia, which I think many people felt was a total diversion of resources from actual frontline services that people had been advocating for many years to actually address the crisis that we have around gender-based violence in Australia. Often what they call age assurance is really age estimation. There's lots of different techniques that they will be trialling, some related to, passports and ID documents, but also things relating to kind of profiling people's behaviours online, looking at your usernames and your IP address and your behaviour and trying to guess what age you are as an internet user, as well as more biometric approaches like facial recognition technology that aims to assess or estimate your age based on your face. And so we did a research project where we looked at 10,000 images using like a state-of-the-art facial recognition software that was aimed to assess people's ages, and our results were very unsurprising in a way. It worked best on white faces, it worked worse on dark faces, boys were more likely to be misclassified than girls, and it got people's ages wrong by up to 40 years. So it was like entirely unreliable, and it's always the promise that the tech will get better, it's fine, it's just on the edge, like we'll make a few tweaks, but those tweaks are always like you have to kind of adjust like how many false positives are acceptable to you and how many false negatives are acceptable to you, and there's always going to be some level of collateral damage, so it's never going to work perfectly. But in our article we basically argued that even if you could get it to work perfectly, which is impossible technically, because there are so many different variables in terms of how people's faces look like, and they tend to look at things like wrinkles and your distribution of facial hair and things that can be very much altered by cosmetics or many, electrolysis or those sorts of things, hormones. And yeah, so we were arguing that even if it was technically possible, it's really still socially undesirable because we're diverting a whole lot of resources, money, attention, energy into this kind of process that will inevitably have many workarounds, which has a whole lot of privacy and feasibility implications, and it conflicts with the research on healthy sexual development, and which is really what Alan's work has been all about. As you mentioned before, people need to be able to ask parents about pornography, to have questions answered without shame. It also lumps everybody under 18 into one age bracket, whereas people's needs around sex and their questions about sex are so completely different for people under 12 to people going through puberty to people who are 16 and 17 who can legally consent to sex and yet are unable to watch sex legally or access pornography legally. So porn literacy has been established in Alan's work. It's part of a Delphi panel that he ran as being a core component of healthy sexual development. So yeah, in our view, age verification is really just a distraction and diversion of resources from what governments could actually be doing.
Thanks. Giselle, what do young people make of things like age verification and social bans? I mean, do they go, oh, awesome, brilliant news, can't wait for it, or are they kind of saying, awesome, great, can't wait for it so we can get around it?
Unsurprisingly, they're not supportive generally. So we have asked teens about their thoughts on age verification, and I have been writing a paper for 2 or 3 years that's slowly coming to form and is very close. But interestingly, I think just to build on what Zara has said in terms of age and looking at the age brackets instead of treating everyone as under 18 as this homogenous group, numerous teens identified that maturity is a better measure for readiness for sexual content than age, but they also acknowledge that it's basically impossible to measure, at least in terms of technological aptitude. So teens identified various ways they would circumvent the measures, VPNs, anonymised browsers. One teen told me, I think I'd turn the webcam to a poster of Nicolas Cage. I don't know who's still got Nicolas Cage on their walls in 2024, but that was the example given. Using a parent's ID, they held concerns around privacy and security, particularly in terms of if digital identification is used, and that is one of the measures that's being looked at in regards to digital tokens, that are temporarily sent to third parties, and they had qualms and concerns over what is the government going to be doing with my data about all the different pornography sites that I'm viewing. So yeah, very much not in favour, but they did recognise that there was a place for regulation of both the pornography industry, which was surprising in terms of advocating for better standards, for sex worker rights, as well as depictions of consent and diversity in sex on screen. And then they also advocated for regulation for younger children, so 12 and below, and then there were varying responses of when it was acceptable, but definitely agreeing that it was more acceptable for teens 16 plus at the age of consent to be able to view pornography.
Thanks,
Alan,
Giselle. Just very quickly, David.
Just real briefly. I'm actually involved in a bunch of legal activity in the United States around age verification, and the point that I keep making is, during prohibition of alcohol in the United States, that actually led to the growth and power of organized crime, because they were bringing in that thing that had been prohibited. Age verification is very likely to drive consumers to sites that are not doing age verification. The sites that are not doing age verification are the less reputable sites that are more likely to post material that is potentially criminal, definitely unethical, and is more likely to be unhealthy. And good luck, Australia, trying to regulate those sites when they're in Eastern Europe or South America or God knows where. The same in the US. And so again, I worry about unintended consequences, and policymakers aren't thinking about that.
Thanks, everybody. It's interesting to be a world leader in a potential massive policy failure, basically. The government have given themselves 12 months before the social media ban comes into force. So it'll be really interesting, I think, what'll happen in this 12 months with the policy formation process, who's involved, and then what they eventually land on in some ways. So, with all policy, ultimately the proof will be in the pudding when we kind of get to see it, which will probably come around Christmas next year, which will be interesting timing. So, I just want to thank all of you for giving up your time this evening and coming and speaking to everybody. I want to thank the audience for coming out tonight as well and sitting with us. I know you're all age verified, so after this panel, there's a social mixer. You can come and stay for a drink. We're going to have some jazz music on as well. Hybrid Warehouse, Darren there we've got a show on tonight. So I want to thank Darren and the Hybrid Warehouse for hosting us here tonight in Fremantle. We wanted to come off campus and do stuff, on the main streets of Frio. So this is what we've done, basically. So thank you very much, Darren, and it's been really great to kind of hang out here this evening. If you're really into your porn and you're really into Dr. Zara Stardust, we're relocating to the main streets of Maylands tomorrow night, and we're having a book launch and an in-conversation. So Zara has published her new book called Indie Porn, Revolution, Regulation and Resistance, and uses my rule of threes, which is my golden rule that I teach all students. So that's amazing to see. Just need some parentheses in there, and then I'll be really, really happy, So that's on it. Rabble Books and Games on 8th Ave in Maylands from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock. It's going to be a book launch, it's going to be an in-conversation, and then there's going to be some food and stuff there as well. So thank you very much, everybody, and I hope you had a good night.